Okay, Galatians chapter 1, guys, thanks so much. It's always a privilege to come and speak here. So I got a few things to share with you in regard to what Mark asked me to speak on, but Galatians chapter 1 will be in the backdrop of what I want to talk about. Starting in verse 11, Paul says, "For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel, for I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my own people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and he who called me by his grace was pleased to reveal his son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles." So here's what I want to do. Mark asked me to speak on the topic of how to speak to the secular mind and secular culture with the authority of the Bible and cultural relevance, which is a passion of mine because I think it is the mission that we're all on. This is not a niche mission. It's not something that some people in the church are supposed to do and other people are supposed to do something else. In fact, the way his email to me, the way he worded it is, here's what I want you to talk about. Why is your church growing? Why can we still preach the Bible and expect people to show up? And why do people return to Village week after week to be yelled at? Such a nice, thanks for that invitation. It's great. Anyway, that's none of those things I'm really going to talk about. But the reality is here's what's really important as we face this cultural moment that we're in. The cultural moment we're in, the mission we're on, what do? First off, we got to diagnose the problem properly. I think for some of us, you get into problems if you misdiagnose a problem. If you misdiagnose a problem, then you're going to come up with really bad answers, or sometimes you answer a problem in the wrong way, and then you kind of go down this road and things go bad. I don't know how many of you are preachers, but I can't look at my wife when I'm preaching. In fact, there's a rule that we created as a family that she has to be completely in the dark at the back when I'm preaching, okay? I don't want to look at her face. And the reason is because she screws me up every time. So I don't want to look at her. Because there's been these moments where, like, I got up at a youth camp one time and she was there in the front row, and I got caught outside talking to someone, so I didn't hear what was going on. And I went inside and I started criticizing worship music and saying how silly it all is sometimes, and how it's, half the songs sound like you could just sing them in a Buddhist temple and they're not actually anything. They're just talking about us running through fields with God and stuff, and they're not saying anything, and they're stupid, and how dumb are we, blah, blah. And she's in the front row, she's going, and I'm like, what are you doing? I don't understand what you're doing. And so then I started to question myself and what I'm saying, and so now I'm distracted for a full 40 minutes as I'm talking, and then I realized, and so afterwards I'm like, well, what, did they sing songs like that and I was criticizing those songs, and then I got up and they had just sung them because I missed, and she's like, no, I don't know what you're talking about, it was a great sermon. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's just your face? Talking about. That's not going to work. I can't look at you. Now, here's the thing. So I thought deep down that we had marital problems. All right, as a pastor, I thought this probably isn't healthy. Other pastors probably don't function like this in life. And then I got to go spend a couple Saturdays ago, I got to spend the morning with the great Dr. James Houston. I don't know if you know who that is. He founded Regent College. He hung out with C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, all right? That's all. He's 96 years old. He was at Oxford. He hung out with them. He's a student with them. So I got some guy said, hey, I go to hang out with them. You should come down and hang out with them. I'm like, great. So I go down there and I'm hanging out with them, and I'm just sitting, I'm asking him questions, and Lewis, it's a different generation of people too, because they just downplay everything. I'm like, you were with C.S. Lewis? Like, yeah, it's great. So he's eating his porridge. I'm like, so we start to talk about all this stuff, and he starts to, and then he says that when he was a pastor, he was sitting around recently. His wife passed away 4 years ago, but she was sitting around with him, and he started to explain in their house to 3 or 4 people that were visiting. In my book, I say this. He's a super smart guy. He's 96 years old. He's doing a lecture at Regent College this summer on Kierkegaard's epistemology. I hope I can eat by myself at 96. This guy's exegeting Kierkegaard. And so anyway, he said to me, he's sitting talking with this group of people who are in his house, and he's like, hey, blah, blah, blah. And then he said, my book so-and-so. And then his wife yells in from the kitchen and says, no one reads your books, James, all right? So then I'm like, okay, I'm starting to feel a little better about myself. And then he literally said this to me. He said it was fascinating, totally unsolicited. He said, I've done consulting at a lot of churches. And when I go consult at a church that's a disaster and they have trouble with the pastor, he said, here's what I do. He said, put me in the room and let me watch, put me in the sight line of two things. I want to hear the sermon and I want to be able to see the wife. And I said, why? And he said, because when I can see the wife, if she's at the front taking notes, because this is what I see sometimes, right? The wife's at the front, and she's taking notes and she's doting on her husband, and there's like, and my wife's at the back with like a shawl over her face. And I'm like, my marriage must suck, I don't get it. And he said, I want to see the wife because if she's sitting in the front row taking notes and nodding her head, something's wrong with the church. And I was like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. So I have a healthy marriage, and that's what I was encouraged about. So point is sometimes you misdiagnose a problem or you misdiagnose the answer to the actual problem that you're raising. So what is the problem we're raising? How do you reach a secular culture? We know we're in a secular culture. We're in a post-enlightenment mood. We know we're in a post-romantic mood. So what do we actually do about it as we start to think through the things? Okay, the first thing we got to do about it is you got to understand. You ask these questions. Why would a church actually be able to reach secular people, post-rationalistic people, maybe evidential thinkers? One of the reasons that comes out of Galatians 1 is it's not about, the reason Village has been able to do this in some way is it hasn't been about me. It's all about God. This is why he looks and he says, you've heard of my former life, how I persecuted. He starts listing out not a bunch of competencies, but a bunch of weaknesses. This is what I used to do. I used to persecute the church. I'm a disaster. I'm a wreck. Anything that good has actually happened in my ministry is not because of me, but in spite of me. That's the first thing everybody in this room has to understand. It's not because of you, it's in spite of you. So get over yourself. Right? Amen to that. All right. You got to believe that about yourself. Some of you know my story. I come from a broken home, atheistic home, agnostic home. Dad divorced my mom. I had Tourette's syndrome. I used to swear randomly at people. I've told you all these stories before. You don't need to hear them again. The point is, it's a really weird job to have as a preacher when you just randomly swear at people because of your mental disorder and you go F and then people gather and you're like, welcome to church. And it's never really going to work. None of this is really going to work. But you got to understand that it's not because of you, it's in spite of you. And he's listing his own brokenness. And he's listing his own past. And he's saying, I was a persecutor. I was a disaster. But God is going to do something great. You got to do it through weakness. Do not get up in front of your people and be the hero of your own story. Jesus is the hero of the story every single time, not you. And if it's you, they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to feel inspired. They're not going to say, they're just going to look at you and go, oh, I hope I could be him or whatever, which would be an utter disaster. You got to be you, though. You got to play to your own strengths. Don't try to be other people. Right? You got to understand, how could I actually reach these people? How could I lead out of weakness? How could I lead out of my own past and my own story and my own history and actually tell them things? But don't try to be someone else. Don't listen to a podcast or read a book and say, now I'm going to preach like that or talk like that or whatever. Don't do that. I have a really good buddy. Do you guys know Chris Brown? Not the pop star, but the pastor down in San Diego? Do you guys? Okay, so 15,000 people, one of the greatest communicators you'll ever meet in your life. And he does this thing where he goes into like first person, like you've seen him where he goes into first person stuff and he's like, all of a sudden, like he's not preaching like about Ezekiel, like he is Ezekiel, right? He's just like, oh, I shall fry up this feces. I shall lay. And you don't know what he's talking about for like the first 20 minutes. And all of a sudden you realize he's doing a first person narrative of a biblical character. And you're like you're like at the edge of it. You're like, oh my gosh, feces. I can't believe what's actually happening. Is it his? No, I think he's a prophet. This is crazy. And you're on this is like the storytelling at its absolute funniest. It's crazy. And he's first person, you get confused. And the whole place, I mean, it speaks everywhere. It's crazy. Could you imagine like Norm Funk trying to do that? It just ain't gonna work for Norm, right? Just like the first person, like Easter, oh, Johanna, I saw him risen. He is risen indeed. What? What's Norm talking about? I don't know. I think he's hammered. It's not gonna work. Don't try to be somebody else. I thought you said he was gone. Johanna. Because here's the deal. if you lead from your weaknesses, if you lead from this stuff, you lead from your own mistakes. If you let the people in to your own mistakes, Paul lists this out and he says, if you lead from your mistakes and God does anything through you, God looks good, but you look bad, and that's okay. Right? That's what you gotta tell your people about the daily comings and goings of your disastrous life. Right? The other day I actually went into the Apple store. I was downtown and I went into the guy, and the guy wouldn't fix my phone, and I was screaming at him. And I'm like, you better get me the phone, you better get me the phone, you better get me the phone, you better. No, I'm gonna sit here and wait for a manager. I will sit here and wait for a manager. You better fix this phone, bro. I can't believe that. I go on 20 minutes. Finally, he comes back, goes, I can't do anything for you. Sorry, Pastor Mark. I'm like, what? You couldn't have led with that? Because I would have treated you completely different if I. You can't. You gotta be able to know your own weaknesses and be able to say, hey, this is who I am, and Jesus uses me in spite of my disaster, in spite of the wreck that I am. I was just in Toronto this past week. I was speaking at a men's conference, and we're in the green room, and we're sitting back there, and this is God doing things in my life in spite of me over and over again. One of the pastors for the church was there. He was, hey, glad to meet you. We started hanging out, and I realized who he was. And I'm like, oh yeah, man, I went to college with your wife. She was super hot. She was like top 5. And the pastor, his boss, looks at me, he's like, who says this stuff? First off, who gets away with it? I don't know who gets away with it. Anyways, point being, you got to be able to lead from yourself, lead from your weaknesses, because in those moments when God does anything in your life, in spite of how you fumble the ball over and over and over again, he gets the glory, which is exactly what he wants. You know, my body twitches around my face because I got touched. How many times I've sat like the Apostle Paul in Corinthians and just prayed, please take this thorn, please take it, it's in my flesh, I hate it, get rid of it, get rid of it. You know what God says? No, I like it. Oh, I'm gonna keep it right there. You're gonna look ridiculous your whole life. You're gonna twitch your stupid body around, because in those moments, you know what? I look good, you look dumb, I'm happy with that. That's literally what God does. And that's biblical, right? That's theologically correct. That's the way we roll. So, first point, you gotta lead from your own self authenticity. So as you go after the secular culture, they're all, what are the reasons they don't like Christianity? Yeah, there's lots of evidential reasons, but there's moralistic reasons. Usually for the guy in the street, the reason he's not going to become a Christian isn't because he's thought through every evil and suffering issue in the world. It's because he doesn't like the church. The church is corrupt. It's moralistic. It's sexuality. It's hell. It's not evidential problems. It's repulsions. Those are the reasons that they don't actually want to become Christians. So here's what you got to understand. You got to lead out of an authenticity. Secondly, you have to understand what Paul says here, which is the church is gathered and saved, and you're the leader of it unto something. It's not an end in itself. Even the theology of election in Ephesians 1 is all about unto something. The church is saved and gathered under God unto a thing, not unto itself, but unto the mission that Jesus has given you to actually reach people. That's the whole point. That's why in verse 16 he says, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. That is your job. So listen, here's what Alan Hirsch says. Don't think church, think mission. And if you think mission, the church becomes subservient to mission. And so sometimes what happens is when people get debating about things, it's because they've got a category mistake. They've mistaken 1 minute, there's tons of stuff we can talk about, but you have different realms of life and ministry. You have Christology, you have missiology, you have ecclesiology, you have ministry. Sometimes I realize there's problems in the church when one guy's talking missiology and another guy's talking ecclesiology, and they've messed up what they're prioritizing. One guy just wants to talk, how is the church governed and how is it structured? But the other guy's talking about how do you missiologically actually reach a culture? And don't miss those. Let them interplay. Let them actually affect one another. But you have to understand, you can't misprioritize. You got to understand the mission of Jesus is the reason we exist on the planet. The church serves that mission. That's the way I would prioritize it. You can debate that if you want. But don't think church, think mission first. The church serves the mission of the church, which means ministry has to be about movement. Stopping sinning and just defending Christianity isn't enough. Your job is not to simply defend the gospel, it's to expand it. Right? That's what Philippians 1 says. Advance the gospel. That's the point. And sometimes I'll meet with leaders And it's literally an adventure in missing the point. They're like my kids, just totally misunderstanding things, totally not get, I give them something that they don't get, and after months of talking to them, they still don't understand. This is what talking to church leaders is like. It's like, guys, our job is not just to sit in our churches and make sure that we got the Bible straight. Yes, 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 and amen. But it's to take that truth and actually expand it out to the world around us, which means movement. Right? And the church needs to be like, you seen that movie World War Z? All right, where the zombies and Brad Pitt says, if you don't move, movement is life. When it comes to the church, when it comes to the mission, when it comes to the gospel, movement is life. And we have to figure out the way the church needs to constantly be moving or it will die. And this is the way you're supposed to move. You're supposed to move, Jesus says, as wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Oftentimes the church is just as innocent as doves. We go after godliness, we go after purity, we go after holiness. Great, that's awesome. But what we fail to do is think like serpents and be shrewd and try to figure out how do you strategically move the gospel into the other areas of life? How do you move it in the arts? How do you move it in the business communities? How do you move it in the sports communities? How do you strategically use technology? All these, if we don't figure that stuff out over and over and over again, we're just going to be left behind as the culture moves on, and we're still sitting having these conversations and the culture's moved on. Why? Because the church never took Jesus' advice to be shrewd as serpents. All we did was focus on being as innocent as doves. The gospel has to keep moving. Your job is not to sit back and be just a defender of it. You actually have to move it forward. In order to do that, what are you gonna do? You gotta understand you as a leader are called by God to move that movement forward, to move the mission forward, whatever your context is. You go back and you look at Judges, you look at the cycle of revival and decline in the Bible. Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the constant cycle of decline and revival. What does God actually do about it? How does he send renewal? He sends leaders who spark a revival. Read Judges 2, read Judges 10, and this is what we're like, okay, he's got to send leaders. He's got to send leaders that understand what their job is in the midst of the church, that understand, that aren't afraid to actually do their job. And here's what I want to tell you, you are needed. You are needed today more than ever. And some of you have shown up here and think, my job as a leader, I'm not really needed anymore. I don't feel needed. You are needed more than I just talked at a men's retreat. And I looked out at these guys and I could see in their eyes, they didn't feel needed. And I shared with them a scene from that movie back in the 90s with Ted Danson called Dads, where they're like, why weren't you around when I was a kid? And he said, you're always working. And Ted Danson, well, this is because I thought that's what men were supposed to do. Like I thought they were supposed to go out and make money and then just provide for their families and bring them money. And that's why I work so hard. And then he stops and he goes, you know what? That's not why I was gone to work all the time. The reason I was gone to work all the time was because at work, I was needed. At work, I was the man. At work, everybody worshiped me. At work, I felt valued. And then I'd walk in the door and I wouldn't know who I was anymore. I would come in, I'd see the kids and you'd hand me a bag of garbage and I didn't know what to do anymore. I felt lost. I felt unneeded. And I'm telling you, 99% of the men in that room agreed that that is exactly how they live their life. That at work, they're so special, they're respected, they're worshiped, and then they come home. I mean, I by God's grace, we started a church and it was just me, and then we got staff under us, and they're the most amazing staff in the world, but I get to be the leader of that. And so at work, man, my opinion, like, that matters, man. I'm the man. It's like 61 staff and just was getting stuff done. It's legit. And then I walk home and my 3 daughters look at me and they go, Mark, what are you doing home? I'm like, what? My name's Father. Talking about, don't call me by my name. You respect me. And I'll try to put them to sleep. And I got 3 daughters. And the other night we were trying to put them to sleep. And they got this big horse in their room. And they're all on this horse. And I'm trying to pray. And they're, Heavenly Father, you're so good. I want to do godliness. And they're all talking and whacking each other on this horse together. And I'm like, hey, enough. You go to your room and get that horse. That horse is in the garbage now. No, Daddy. And then I hear Erin, boom, 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 coming up the stairs. You come back into the room and she starts defiling my authority. And I'm like, what did you do? And then I go downstairs and we start fighting. I almost left the house. I'm like, you realize that they're just trying to screw us, right? You know that. You realize they woke up this morning just twisting their mustache, trying to figure out how to ruin our marriage. That is literally what they do strategically in life. My authority is to file that home. I feel like a loser. At work, I'm the boss. So yeah, I'll get hobbies. Yeah, I'll hang out outside the house. And I looked at these men and I said, never has there been a time where you're more needed, even though you don't feel like it. And I'm saying the same to you as leaders. Never is there a time. You want to talk about cultural reformation. You want to talk about renewals and revivals. Look at Judges. He raises up leaders, not just people. You're supposed to lead and exemplify the mission and say, this is how we do it. And some of you are here, you're doubting your leadership. You're doubting what role you actually have to play. This is what God does. Now, there's two kinds of things we need to do. We need to both convince people at the level of the mind that Christianity is reasonable, rational, because it defies it answers the enlightenment question. And so some of you need to be able to lead and preach and understand that you are doing the work of an evangelist, but you're doing it in a way that the regular Joe in the street who says scientifically, here's Mark Knoll wrote a book years ago called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he said, listen, here's the problem. The scandal of the evangelical mind is there isn't much of an evangelical mind. And the two things he cites were the reasons where Christianity started to get laughed at. Is he says this, on the one hand, there's the enormous growth of the church, and on the other, it's almost complete lack of influence. Think about that for a second. Churches grow, but there's no cultural influence. Why? Knoll says, the modern Christian world is activistic, populist, meaning easy to swallow, and pragmatic. It works for your life. But it allows little space for broader or deeper intellectual effort because it's dominated by the urgencies of the moment. And Knoll says the reason is two things actually happen to us in the modern world, which I think we need to kick against and renew. The first one was everyone looked at us as anti-intellectual. Christianity pitted itself against science, and everyone just started to write us off because we were walking around saying, hey, don't worry, the world's only this many years old, and we rode around on dinosaurs, and everybody in any university went, laughing stock, I'm done with you, I don't want to listen to you anymore. And the second thing that happened is we became the radical biblical prophecy people. We became the people who every 5 years we'd think it was the end of the world. We'd say Ronald Reagan's the mark of the beast, Oprah's the mark of the beast. Hey, and we just started to be laughed at. I remember when I first became a Christian, I showed up at my buddy's house, and he had this stack of videos, and it was like, it's the end of the world, it's the end of the world, look at this, the computer's the mark of the beast, and all this thing, and I'm watching this, and my wife grew up in a church where she watched this like video, she tells me about it, she said it's in her brain, where everyone like got raptured off the world, and like some guy shaving, all right, and his razor's like sitting on the ground going, and all the airplanes are crashing. You don't think the world laughs at us? We look like a bunch of anti-intellectual people who've forgotten that science has actually grew out of the matrix of Christianity, that Christianity all through history is known for its intellectual life, its philosophers, its psychologists, its scientists, and we've pitted ourselves against it, and basically people look at us and say, we're not talking to you anymore. Look at the top 10 best-selling Christian books right now. What are they about? I'm not going to listen for you, but you can go do the list, go look yourself. Here's what Charles Malik said when he's speaking at the Billy Graham School of Evangelism back in the 90s. And this is what I think you as a person and your churches should do as a vision. At the heart of all the problems facing Western civilization, the manifold perversions of personal character, the problems of the family, problems of economics and politics, problems of the media, problems affecting the school itself and the church itself. At the heart of the crisis in Western civilization lies the state of the mind. The true task of the evangelical world is not only to win souls, for if you win the whole world and lose the mind of the world, you will soon discover you have not won the world. Indeed, it may turn out you've actually lost it. Think about that. Your job is to go win the mind. Love God with your heart, soul, mind. That's not anti-Christian. You actually have to convince people that Christianity is historical, that it's the best idea in the marketplace of ideas in regard to science, philosophy, psychology, literature, history, that Jesus really rose from the dead. And as a guy who didn't come to church when I was 19, no one was talking about that. I had to sit and read the Gospels and be like, oh my goodness, Jesus actually rose from the dead. And there's no great explanation for the rise of the church outside of Jesus rising from the dead. There's no good explanation. My buddies would come in and no, that's not true. You don't understand. The Roman Empire, they put him up there and he died and they thought he was dead. It's called the swoon theory. He just got, and they took him off and they threw him in a pile, and a day or so later he got back. Like that's the dumbest theory, because the one thing the Roman Empire knew how to do, it was kill people. They would kill 6,000 people on a single day. The guys didn't tend to get up and go, that was close. You don't run an empire like that. And I started looking at the philosophy, and I started looking at the history, and I started looking at the science of it, and beginning to realize that all the philosophers through all the time recognize if something begins to exist, it has to have a cause. And so everybody said, well, the universe is the uncaused thing. It's forever, it's eternal, whatever. Until Edward Hubble looked through his telescope and realized, no, 15 billion years ago, the universe began to exist. All time, matter, space, energy in a single moment came into existence. Now, if you're an atheist and a naturalist, you have a problem, because everything that begins to exist has to have a cause. The universe began to exist. Ergo, the universe had to have a cause. I started looking into the philosophy of it, the reality that I had a moral law stitched within my soul, and I didn't understand why. I remember when I first, why do we know the difference between, why do we know the difference between right and wrong? Objective moral values, actual objective. And I'd stand up in front of my friends. One Friday night, I was smoking weed, sitting in a garage. The next Friday, I gave my life to Jesus. 3 weeks later, I'm back in the same garage, now defending Christianity, still high because the garage is full of smoke. And I'm having to defend Christianity to them. And what are we talking about? We're talking about the moral law. Why do you know the difference between right and wrong? They said, oh, that's subjective. I remember when I moved out here to Vancouver, I went through the Nexus line. You very quickly find out that morality is not subjective. That people, if somebody says to you morality is subjective and it's not objective, just cut in line on them and see. I told the church the other day, or just chop a guy in the throat. And when he says, why'd you just chop me in the throat? Go, oh, don't put your values on me, bro. Do not project your cultural values on me. This is how I feel good in my life. I just chop people in the throat as I walk around. I'm just doing me, all right? And when I moved to Vancouver, there was this Nexus line. I didn't know what a Nexus line was. I didn't have a Nexus card. And so there was this 3 hours of traffic going down across the border, and then just one big empty Nexus line. I just drove down it. I was like, wow, these guys are fools. I got to the end of it, and I'm like, oh crap, I do not have a Nexus card. So I cut in line, and right behind me, there was these 3 big guys in a truck, massive guys. They'd just been hunting or something. They surely killed something. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And I looked in the rear view, and these guys are like, blah, blah, blah. They're screaming at me. So there's one of 2 things that you do when you look like me and someone wants to get really mad and fight you. You either run or you act crazy. And so I acted crazy. And I parked my car and I got out of the car. So I go, what's going on? And I walked up to the car and they did up their windshield. They're like, very quickly we found out that objective moral value, that bothered me. It bothered me as an atheist and a naturalist that I knew what rape was and I didn't like it. That it felt wrong. When my father died and I was 15 years old and I'm sitting there over his casket, I'm comparing the universe to something when I say this feels wrong. It feels like something's disjointed. Well, if all I did was get my morals from hundreds of thousands of years of cognitive ability that came through evolutionary discussion, then I wouldn't think it was wrong. I'd have nothing to compare this with. This is just natural. I would just think like an animal. But for some reason, I had moral laws that transcended the animal kingdom. I was different somehow. I didn't know why. Do you know? I got buddies who are like, no, we get all our moralities just from the encoding, the cognitive faculties that got encoded. I'm like, well, really? So why do I think different than an animal? You know a praying mantis, after a female is done having sex with the male praying mantis, you know what she does to him? Rips his head off. Why don't we do that? The women are done with you. They don't actually need you anymore. But for some reason we don't. We go, this is probably not a good law to install in society. Somewhere along the line, you stop thinking like a praying mantis. Why? That was a problem for me. And so you have to get people to understand that here's the key. You have to get them thinking about the lack in their own worldview, the contradictory nature of their own worldview. They cannot actually live out what they believe. I've spent my life trying to convince people. You have to go along, whatever you believe about the world, my own family, my grandma passed away 3 years ago now. I went back, my own atheistic family looks at me and they're like, I'm so glad that she's not suffering anymore. And I looked at them and said, hold on a sec, you're a naturalist, right? You bust my chops for having a view about the afterlife, metaphysics, that I understand things about the soul and God and whatever, and you just told me she's not suffering anymore. How do you know she's not suffering more than she was suffering? How do you know that? Do you know where she is? Oh, wait, so you do have a view of the afterlife, which is there isn't one. You have a medical view. You have a faith position. But you don't actually have anything you just kind of go along with how you feel. And that's how you've constructed a worldview. That doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about the historicity of the biblical story that gives you all of this. You're trying to let people understand their own worldview and the flaws within it is part of how you win the mind of the world. That is your task. The second part of our task is that we actually need, and by the way, that is going to create a collision as you speak that over and over and over again, because your job is to actually have a worldview collision with the people around you. You know that. Everything about you is going to collide with the culture around you. That's okay. That's part of your job. Your job is to get up and show people how silly they're living their life. That's like literally, I talked to our church the other day. We were talking about money. And I looked at them and I said, look, I know this is not, very un-Canadian of me, but I actually get a printout of what you all give. So just know when I'm interacting with you in the foyer, I get a number sign over your head. And I said, some of you are really cheap, but you're here. You know it costs money to heat this room? It costs money to feed my kids. You are a non-contributing zero who sucks resources. So here's your options. Start giving or go to another church so they can, quote, carry your dead bones around. And the church grew by 500 people the next week. There are 500 more people there the next week. Why? Because people are sick of church lingo. Like we are so grace-filled, people don't even know if they're getting fired. They walk out of the room, 10 minutes, they're like, did I just get fired? I don't actually understand what happened in that room. I know there's a lot of encouragement. I'm gonna have to actually go back and ask, do I still work here? You want to reach the world, man? They're not care about all that stuff. They're like, just tell me what you believe. I don't have to believe it. Just tell me what you actually believe. You know, that's what they say. You know, David Hume, the great Scottish skeptic, hated Christianity. And he was going to watch George Whitefield preach one day, and someone said, where are you going? He said, I'm going to watch George Whitefield preach. Why? You don't even believe anything he says. And he says, yeah, but he does. I'll go watch him because he actually believes this stuff. Okay, anyway, the second point is not only the life of the mind, but it's got to be the life of the heart. It's got to be the life of the affections. And why I say that is because if you read James K. Smith, what he talks about is he says that the most powerful thing that you're competing with is actually the life of the heart. The most powerful thing that you're competing with is not just what people think, it's what people feel. It's in fact, your gut is the main way that you make decisions in life, right? You go after pleasure, you go after delight. Even if the reason, it's far more powerful. Some of us are afraid of flying. We don't love flying. Why? You get in a plane, statistically, you're in the safest place on the planet. But something about it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel safe. Why? Because at that moment, your gut is actually taking over your reason. You can give someone all the stats in the world, but now you're actually feeling something based on your gut. I sit with people all the time, and I'm like, hey, I'll sit with a couple and they'll come in and they'll be wanting to get married, and I'll just see total disconnect. And I'll take the guy aside and I'll be like, do not marry this woman. Do not marry this girl. Why not? She's hot. I'm like, yeah, that's the problem. Here's the data. Here's the reasons you shouldn't marry her, the disconnect, the lack of communication, the conflict, the data. Here's all the stuff that's gonna happen. And what does he do 9 times out of 10? Marries her anyway. Why? 'Cause she's hot. He's thinking with his gut. Why? Because you could put all the data in the world in front of somebody. And if they have pleasure in something, they can't hear you, man. You want to know, this is what I tell the people when they show up for Christmas. Do your churches grow Christmas Eve? How many people say come to these Christmas Eve services, they double in size, and we do everything in our power. Hope you come back. Look at me, I'm on a unicycle. Hey, look at me, everybody's nice. Everybody on their best behavior. Let's wow everybody, we're gonna come back. No one ever comes back, by the way. I've been doing this 9 years. I'm just not even gonna start showing up for Christmas Eve anymore. It's just gonna be like, whatever. My Christmas Eve sermon will be, God hates you, figure it out. I don't know. You ain't coming back anyway. I don't know why we're spending thousands of dollars trying to figure out how to get you back. Anyways, so what I say to them is, look, you're at Christmas Eve, great, glad you're here. But the problem is why aren't you here last week? And why won't you come back next week? Is that your thing? You just kind of put on your nice pants and you come here with grandma because she told you to come to church, you're going to go have ham after? That's a really silly way to live your life. And then I look at them and I say this, you see, you're probably not going to accept Christ today. You're probably not going to become a Christian. And the reason isn't because you philosophically haven't wrestled the problem of evil and suffering to the ground. The reason isn't because you philosophically can't understand the scientific equations of naturalism. The reason is because you're a coward. That's why. Because you're afraid of what your girlfriend's going to think. And you're afraid of what your family's going to think when you go home and tell them you become a follower of Jesus. You see, the problem is you're not thinking with your brain. You're thinking with how you feel. And the problem with how you feel is how you feel can get you in trouble very quickly. Ask any married man. When you're 15 years into a marriage and nothing's going great, but you go to the grocery store and the lady in aisle 4 is batting her little eyelashes at you and things look good. How you feel can derail your life, bro. Be careful to decide your life on how you feel in any given moment. But here's where the gospel comes in. Because what's the beauty of it? It changes not only what you think, it not only changes what you do, it changes how you feel. It changes your affections. It doesn't change what you do, it changes what you want to do. See here, R.C. Sproul said the thing about Christianity is we need to show 3 things about God. The goodness, the trueness, and the beauty. You know what part of your job is? To show how good and beautiful God is, not just that he's true. Not that he's right. You got to get after their affections because that's actually going to change them. Going to change, and I'll leave you with this. You know that people are hungry for it. We did church in the park this past year, and we gather in a park and we do worship and preach about Jesus. And there was one of our staff walked up to this guy, and there's this pond at the park, and this guy had a fishing rod, and he's sitting in there during church in the park with a fishing rod. And they walked up to him and they said, "Hey, what are you doing here?" He goes, "I'm just fishing." And they're like, "Oh, crazy." They just start talking to him about Jesus. 20 minutes into the conversation, he goes, "Yeah, there's no fish in this pond. I actually just wanted to hear what he had to say. I heard there was a church gathering here today." Think about that. The guy went and got a fish. He had to strategically think through this, all right? He went and got a fishing rod from his garage, walked out and pretended there was fish. That's how hungry people are. They want to know, but they don't want to just know that Christianity is true. They want to know that it works. That's why he's there. He wants to know it can change his life and give him meaning and purpose and change his marriage and get him off that addiction. He wants to know that it actually works to change him. And that's what you got to show them, actually. That's your job, to show them that Christianity is not only the truest thing in the world, it's actually the most beautiful. All right. I think I'm over time. Let me pray. Lord, our job before us is extremely heavy. It weighs on us as leaders. And we want to do it effectively. We want to do it efficiently. We want to do it well. And I think these 2 elements are a key. Help us be really effective in ministry. Whatever, if we're youth pastors or women's pastors, whatever we are. Help us actually reach the mind well and reach the emotional life well. Let us not only preach one or the other. Let us not only do ministry in a way that captures one or the other, that we'd somehow find that beautiful balance that could actually change a life. Not only change what we do, change what we want to do. Let people actually fall in love with the beauty and the glory of God himself. Not just ideas, not just concepts, not just cognitive thinking, not just the fact that they vote different than their neighbor or they think different things about the Trinity than their neighbor, that it goes way beyond that. It goes into their very life because it goes into what they believe, not only, but how they feel about the world around them, what they actually love. Let us do that well. In Jesus' great name we pray. Amen. All right, thanks guys, appreciate it.